Billionaires stay quiet, celebrities stay loud. And somehow it's the quiet ones who keep the money. This is not a coincidence. It is not modesty. It is not some personality quirk where a handful of wealthy people happen to be introverts who dislike cameras. It is a pattern that repeats so consistently, across industries, across decades, across completely different personalities, that it points to something structural, something almost nobody names out loud. Here it is. Attention and wealth do not run on the same fuel. They are not even neutral toward each other. They are, in a very real sense, opposing forces. One depletes what the other needs to grow. Most people assume the opposite. Most people believe that visibility is the reward for success, that once you have made it, the spotlight naturally follows, and standing in that spotlight is simply what winning looks like. Get rich, get known, get richer. It seems like a loop that feeds itself. But that assumption is wrong. Look closely at where real fortunes are built. Not spent, not performed, but built. And you find something strange. The people compounding the largest amounts of capital are, disproportionately, the ones you cannot name. You know the entertainer, you know the influencer, you know the reality star with the clothing line. You do not know the person who owns the warehouse the clothing line ships from, or the fund that holds the equity behind 3 of your favorite consumer brands, or the family office quietly controlling a piece of the infrastructure your city runs on. This is the principle almost nobody sees. Visibility is not a reward for wealth. For most forms of durable wealth, visibility is a threat to it. Think about what fame actually requires to maintain. It requires an image, and images are expensive. They require a certain home, a certain car, a certain wardrobe, a certain vacation, a certain circle. Not because any of it is necessary, but because the audience expects it, and disappointing the audience has a cost. Fame requires publicists, security, legal teams to manage the lawsuits that follow any public figure with money. Fame invites people who want something from you, investment pitches, favors, loans dressed up as opportunities, and saying no to enough of them, enough times, becomes its own full-time job. Now think about what happens to money that sits inside a business, a piece of real estate, an ownership stake, a fund. It does not need a wardrobe. It does not need to be defended in public opinion. It does not attract dinner invitations from people hoping to be noticed alongside it. It just sits there doing the only thing capital actually does well, which is compound, quietly, without an audience, without a reaction to manage. Most people miss this entirely because we have been trained to measure success by how much attention it generates. More followers must mean more value. More press must mean more importance. But followers and press are not assets. They do not appear on a balance sheet. In fact, in many cases, they are closer to a liability, something that has to be fed, managed, and protected, and that generates ongoing costs whether or not it generates ongoing income. Here is where the pattern gets interesting. Fame and wealth used to be more aligned than they are now, back when visibility was scarce and expensive to acquire, when being known required something rare, like owning a newspaper or a television network. In that world, visibility itself was a kind of wealth, because so few people had access to it. That world is gone. Visibility is now nearly free. Anyone with a phone can generate an audience, which means visibility on its own no longer signals value. It signals only that someone was willing to trade privacy for attention. And that trade has a price that most people never calculate, because the price does not show up immediately. It shows up later in the form of scrutiny during a downturn, in the form of copycats undercutting a business model the moment it becomes visible enough to study, in the form of legal exposure that only exists because everyone knows exactly how much you have and exactly where to find you. Have you noticed successful people operate by different rules about this? Not different values, different rules. A celebrity's income often depends on being seen. Visibility is the product, so the exposure is the point, and they accept the tax that comes with it because there is no other way to get paid. But someone building wealth through ownership, through markets, through structures that don't require an audience to function, for that person, visibility offers no corresponding income. It only offers cost. So the incentive is completely reversed. One group is paid to be seen. The other group pays, in ways both large and small, for every unit of attention they accidentally attract. This is the first thing to understand before anything else makes sense. The two paths, fame and fortune, look similar from a distance because both involve some form of success. But they are built on entirely different relationships to attention. One treats visibility as inventory, the other treats it as risk. Once you see this distinction, you cannot unsee it. Every public figure with money starts to look different, not more or less impressive, just differently positioned, playing a different game with a different cost structure. And every quiet fortune, every name you have never heard attached to something enormous, starts to make a new kind of sense, because the quiet ones are not hiding from success, they are protecting it. So if visibility is a cost, why does anyone pursue it at all? Why do so many people spend enormous energy trying to be seen, trying to be known, trying to build an audience, when the pattern in Section 1 suggests that audience will eventually cost them more than it gives? The answer is that for a while, visibility genuinely does pay. This is what makes the trap so effective. It is not a scam. It is not irrational. Early on, attention behaves exactly like an asset. A following opens doors. A following gets you meetings you couldn't get otherwise, deals you couldn't access otherwise. A first check from someone who believed in the audience before they believed in the business. For a season, visibility and value move in the same direction, reinforcing each other, and anyone paying attention would reasonably conclude that more visibility must always be better. But that assumption is wrong, and here is where it breaks. Visibility has a shelf life as an asset. At a certain size, it stops generating opportunity and starts generating obligation. The audience that once opened doors now expects constant feeding, new content, new appearances, new proof of relevance, on a schedule that has nothing to do with whether the underlying business or fortune is actually growing. And this is the part almost nobody accounts for going in. An audience does not pause when you need to think, build, or rest. It keeps expecting. The moment you stop feeding it, it starts questioning whether you still matter, and that question, asked publicly and often, is its own kind of cost. This is where the pattern splits people into two very different trajectories. And understanding this split is the core of everything else in this insight. Path A is the one almost everyone takes by default, because it is the one the culture rewards visibly and immediately. Path A says, build the audience, keep the audience engaged, let the audience become the foundation of the enterprise. Income, opportunity, even self-worth start to root through how many people are watching. This path feels productive because the feedback is instant. A post performs, a video gets views, a follower count climbs, and each of these produces a small hit of validation that feels exactly like progress. Path B is quieter and far less immediately rewarding, which is precisely why fewer people choose it. Path B says, build the thing itself, the asset, the ownership stake, the system, the process, and let visibility stay optional, used only when it directly serves a transaction, never as the foundation the whole enterprise leans on. Someone on Path B might go months or years without any public recognition of what they're building, because the building does not require an audience to function. It requires capital, structure, patience, and time undisturbed. Here is the framework that explains the difference, and it deserves a name, because once you have the name, you start noticing it everywhere. This is the exposure tax. The exposure tax works like this. Every unit of visibility you acquire is not free. It comes with a recurring bill paid not in dollars directly, but in scrutiny, in obligation, in imitation, and in vulnerability. Scrutiny, because visible success invites people to look for flaws, to question legitimacy, to dig for a story. Obligation, because an audience expects ongoing performance, ongoing access, ongoing proof that you are still who they think you are. Imitation, because anything visible enough to admire is visible enough to copy. Competitors don't need to guess your strategy if you've broadcast it. And vulnerability, because the more known you are, the more precisely people, good faith and bad faith alike, know exactly where to find you, what you have, and what pressure might extract it. Most people think of visibility as something they accumulate, like savings, but the exposure tax means visibility behaves more like a mortgage. You don't just receive it, you owe on it continuously for as long as you hold it. and like any mortgage, the payments feel manageable at first. It's only later, as the balance of attention grows, that the size of the bill becomes obvious. This is why Path B wins over long time frames, even though it looks less impressive in the short term. Path B does not eliminate visibility. It simply refuses to let visibility become the load-bearing wall of the enterprise. Attention is spent deliberately in small controlled amounts, only where it produces a specific return. A deal that requires a public profile to close, a negotiation where reputation adds leverage, a moment where being known briefly serves a very specific purpose. Then it recedes again. The tax is paid occasionally for a clear reason, instead of continuously, for no reason beyond habit. Compare this to the way most public success stories actually end. The pattern is familiar enough that it barely needs describing: rapid rise in visibility, income that appears to follow, and then a slow erosion, not always from one dramatic collapse, but from years of the exposure tax quietly eating margin. Money spent maintaining an image rather than building an asset. Deals taken not because they were sound, but because turning them down would look inconsistent with the persona. Legal and reputational costs that only exist because everyone always knew exactly how much there was to lose. Meanwhile, the fortunes that last tend to share a strange, boring quality. For long stretches, nothing observable happens at all. No headlines, no milestones announced, just capital sitting inside a structure, compounding, untaxed by attention, because no one was watching closely enough to demand anything of it. This is the psychology worth sitting with. It is not that visible people are reckless and invisible people are wise. It's that one group is unconsciously paying a tax they've never identified, while the other group has, intentionally or not, arranged their lives so that tax rarely comes due. Once you can see the exposure tax, a strange thing happens. You start noticing it isn't just a financial pattern. It shows up in careers, in relationships, in reputations, anywhere attention and value intersect. And this is where the pattern reveals something even bigger than money. Consider two people at the same company, both talented, both ambitious. One spends energy making sure everyone knows what they're working on. Updates in every meeting, credit claimed loudly, visibility treated as the currency of advancement. The other quietly builds the thing that actually matters, the system, the relationship, the process that the business now depends on, and says almost nothing about it until someone else needs to know. For a while, the loud one looks like they're winning. They get noticed. They get early opportunities. But notice what also comes with that visibility. Every mistake is public too. Every reorganization looks at the most visible names first, because visibility invites scrutiny in both directions, when things are good and when they aren't. The quiet one, meanwhile, has become quietly indispensable. Removing them would break something real. No audience had to be convinced of that. The system proved it. This is not an accident of personality. It is the exposure tax operating inside a career instead of a balance sheet. Now here is the deeper layer, the one that explains why this pattern isn't just financially smart, but psychologically inevitable for anyone who understands it. Most people think being seen and being valuable are the same thing, because for most of human history, they effectively were. In small tribal groups, status was earned through visible display, the hunt witnessed by others, the resources shared publicly, the reputation built in front of the whole group, because there was no other way for information to travel. Being seen doing something valuable was the only mechanism for being recognized as valuable at all. That wiring never left us. It just moved into a completely different environment, one where visibility can now be manufactured without any underlying value at all, and where the group is no longer 40 people who know your history, but millions of strangers with no context and no memory beyond the last post. The instinct says, more eyes on me means more value. The modern environment says, more eyes on you means more people who can copy you, question you, or come looking for something. This mismatch is the psychological engine behind why so many capable people still choose Path A, even after seeing the costs. It doesn't feel like a mistake in the moment. It feels like being seen, which some very old part of the brain still registers as safety, as status, as winning. Recognizing this is not about blaming anyone for wanting to be noticed. It is about recognizing the instinct for what it is, a survival-era shortcut, not a modern financial strategy. The people who avoid the trap are not the ones without the instinct. They simply learned, usually the hard way, that the instinct is measuring the wrong thing now. And once that recalibration happens, the pattern in sections 1 and 2 stops being abstract. It becomes an operating rule. Build value first. Let recognition follow only where it's useful, and treat every unsolicited spike in visibility as a bill arriving, not a prize being handed over. This closes the first insight. The pattern is not that wealthy people dislike attention, and it's not that famous people are careless with money. It's that one path routes success through an audience and pays the exposure tax continuously, while the other routes success through ownership and pays it only when there's a specific return worth the price. But naming the pattern only answers part of the question. It doesn't yet explain why some people are able to resist an instinct this old, this deep, and this universally shared, while most people, even smart, capable people, never manage to escape it. That is where we go next. Here is a question worth sitting with. If the exposure tax is real, and if it quietly erodes so many public fortunes, why doesn't everyone simply stop? Why do intelligent, capable people keep feeding an audience that costs them more than it gives, long after the pattern should be obvious? The answer isn't a lack of intelligence. It's that the instinct driving path A isn't really about strategy at all. It's about identity. For most people who build any kind of following, an audience, a public persona, a recognizable name, the visibility stops being a tool at some point and becomes the thing itself. This is the part almost nobody accounts for going in. It doesn't happen through one dramatic decision. It happens gradually, through thousands of small moments where being seen felt good, where recognition arrived faster than actual results, where the applause became easier to access than the harder, slower work of building something an audience never needs to witness. Once that shift happens, stepping back from visibility doesn't feel like a smart financial adjustment. It feels like disappearing. It feels like losing something core to who you are. And very few people will make a financially rational decision that feels, on a deeper level, like erasing themselves. This is the psychological trap most discussions of fame and fortune miss entirely. They treat it as a math problem. Weigh the costs, weigh the benefits, choose accordingly. But for the people caught inside it, the math is almost irrelevant, because the real transaction was never about money. It was about proof. Visibility became proof of relevance, proof of worth, proof that the work mattered, because an audience was watching and reacting in real time, and that reaction became the measurement, replacing whatever internal sense of value the person might have built instead. Compare this to how the quiet path operates. Someone building an asset, a system, an ownership stake that requires no audience. They still need proof that their work matters, but they get that proof from a different source entirely. From the thing working, from the business running without them in the room, from the deal closing, the structure holding, the number on the statement changing, whether or not a single other person ever notices. Their sense of value is anchored to results they can verify privately. The other path anchors value to a reaction they can only receive publicly. This is the core psychological difference, and it deserves to be named plainly. One path measures worth through private verification. The other measures worth through public reaction, and only one of those sources of proof can be manufactured, gamed, and inflated without anything real underneath it. The fund manager I worked with described it precisely. Early in her career, she noticed she felt more confident after a good television segment than after a genuinely strong quarter of returns. The segment gave her an immediate, visible reaction: comments, invitations, recognition. The strong quarter just sat quietly on a report nobody outside her firm would ever read. It took her years to notice that the feeling from the segment faded within days, while the confidence from the quarter compounded the same way the returns did. She started declining most media requests after that, not out of humility, but because she realized she'd been chasing the wrong kind of proof. This illustrates something important. The pull toward visibility isn't really about vanity, and it isn't a character flaw. It's a mismeasurement. The brain is built to trust reactions it can see and feel in real time far more than outcomes it has to verify through patience, paperwork, or time. A round of applause registers instantly. A compounding asset registers over years. Given the choice between an immediate, vivid signal and a slow, invisible one, most nervous systems will reach for the immediate signal every time, even when the slow one is worth far more. This is why simply knowing about the exposure tax isn't enough to escape it. Knowledge doesn't override the nervous system's preference for instant proof. What actually changes people's behavior is finding an alternative source of proof that feels just as real, just as immediate, just as convincing. But that comes from verified results instead of visible reaction. This is the beginning of the mental model this insight is building toward. The idea that value and validation are two entirely separate currencies, and most people have never noticed they're paying with the wrong one. If value and validation are separate currencies, the next question is why one currency became so much easier to trade in than the other, and why that ease is precisely what makes it dangerous. Validation is available on demand. Post something, and within minutes you get a number. Views, likes, comments, shares. The signal is instant, quantified, and constantly refreshed. Value, by contrast, is slow to confirm. A business takes years to prove it works. An investment takes a market cycle to prove it was sound. A reputation for reliability takes a decade of quiet consistency to actually mean something. There is no dashboard for that. No notification arrives to tell you your patience just compounded. Given a choice between a currency you can check every 5 minutes and one you can only check every 5 years, most people will unconsciously optimize for the one with faster feedback, even when they know, intellectually, that the slower currency is worth more. This is not a moral failing. It's simply how attention allocates itself when one option provides constant, vivid signals and the other provides almost none. This is where the mental model gets its full shape. Call it the exposure tax operating on the input side, not just the cost side. People don't just pay a tax for visibility they already have. They actively bid for more of it, because visibility is the only currency that pays out immediately. Meanwhile, the compounding path, the one building real value, pays nothing visible for long stretches, which makes it feel, incorrectly, like nothing is happening at all. Here is the two-path comparison in full, because this is the core framework this entire audiobook is built around. Path A treats recognition as the goal. Success is measured by how many people know your name, how often you're mentioned, how visible your rise appears to others. The rewards arrive early and often, in the form of attention, and attention feels like momentum. But every unit of that attention comes preloaded with the exposure tax described earlier: scrutiny, obligation, imitation, vulnerability. And because the rewards arrive so quickly, the tax bill quietly compounds in the background, unnoticed until a downturn or a mistake calls it due all at once. Path B treats recognition as optional, a tool to be used only when it serves a specific transaction. Success is measured by whether the underlying thing, the asset, the system, the relationship, the skill, actually works, whether or not anyone else has noticed. The rewards arrive late and quietly, which makes this path feel, especially in the early years, like nothing is happening. There is no applause to confirm progress. But because visibility was never the foundation, there is also no exposure tax accumulating in the background. What compounds instead is the asset itself, undisturbed. Why does Path B win, given how much harder it is to sustain psychologically? Because time is the one ingredient every form of real value needs, and time is exactly what constant visibility interrupts. A business under public scrutiny faces pressure to perform quarter to quarter instead of building for a decade. A person known for a specific persona feels pressure to keep proving that persona rather than quietly evolving past it. Attention doesn't just cost something directly, it changes the timeline available to you, compressing decisions that need years into a performance that has to look good every week. This is the piece almost nobody sees clearly enough to act on. Visibility doesn't just tax you, it rushes you. And rushed decisions in almost every domain that compounds, money, relationships, skill, reputation, are worse decisions. A founder I spoke with once described the moment this became obvious to her. Her company had raised money publicly, with press coverage and investor announcements treated as milestones worth celebrating. 2 years in, She realized every strategic decision was being made with one eye on how it would look in the next update, not just whether it was right for the business. She eventually moved to structuring her next venture privately, funded by people who wanted results, not updates. The pace of her decisions slowed down. The quality of them went up. This is the psychology fully assembled now. People chase visibility because it offers instant proof in a world that mostly demands patient proof. That instant proof feels like value, but functions as debt, a debt that compresses the very time frames that real value depends on to grow, which raises the practical question. The rest of this insight and the next one exist to answer. If the instinct toward visibility is this deeply wired, how does anyone actually build the discipline to choose the slower, quieter path and keep choosing it, especially when no one is applauding along the way? The discipline to choose the slower path doesn't come from willpower. Willpower is a limited resource, and anyone relying on it to resist an instinct this old will eventually lose. What actually works is something more structural, changing what you use to measure progress in the first place. Remember the core distinction from the last section. Validation is available on demand. Value is slow to confirm. Most people never escape the pull toward visibility because they never build an alternative feedback loop fast enough to compete with it. They know abstractly that the slow path is better, but knowing that doesn't help when the only feedback available in a given week comes from an audience and silence from everywhere else. The people who successfully choose Path B tend to do one specific thing differently. They build private scoreboards, not public ones, numbers, benchmarks, and check-ins that confirm progress to them on a schedule fast enough to satisfy the nervous system's hunger for feedback, but private enough that the feedback never becomes performance. A monthly review of a business's actual numbers, a quarterly look at a portfolio's real position, not its perceived one. A private log of skills improved, relationships deepened, systems strengthened, evidence that something real is compounding, visible to exactly one audience, the person doing the building. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because it solves the actual mechanism behind Path A's pull. People don't chase visibility because they're shallow. They chase it because it's the fastest available proof that their effort is working. Take away the need for public proof by supplying private proof instead, and the pull weakens considerably, not because the instinct disappears, but because it's finally being fed by something that doesn't come with a tax attached. There's a second piece to this, and it's just as important. Understanding that invisibility is not the same as absence. This is where a lot of people, hearing this pattern for the first time, misapply it. They assume the lesson is to disappear entirely. No presence, no relationships, no visibility of any kind ever. That's not the model. That's just Path A's mistake in reverse, trading one imbalance for another. The actual model is selective exposure. Visibility deployed deliberately in specific amounts, for specific reasons, then withdrawn again. A person building real wealth might still show up publicly to close a specific deal that requires credibility, to attract a specific partner who needs proof of track record, to recruit a specific hire who wants to know who they're joining. In each of these cases, visibility is a tool being used for a transaction, not a lifestyle being maintained for its own sake. The exposure is paid for deliberately because it buys something specific. Then it recedes. This is the difference between renting visibility and living in it. Renting it means stepping into view for a purpose, completing the transaction, and stepping back out, paying the exposure tax once for a clear return. Living in it means the visibility never turns off, which means the tax never stops accruing, whether or not anything is actively being purchased with it that week. Most people who build any kind of public profile never make this distinction. They treat every appearance as free, because in the moment it usually is. No one hands you an invoice for a well-received interview or a strong quarter of engagement. But the invoice arrives anyway later, distributed across scrutiny, imitation, and obligation, and by the time it's due, it's hard to trace back to any single decision that caused it. Her closing point here matters, because it reframes everything discussed in this insight. The goal was never to make attention immoral, or fame inherently bad, or visibility something to be feared. The goal is to see it clearly as a currency with a cost, so it can be spent the way any resource with a cost should be spent, deliberately for a specific return, not habitually out of a need for constant proof that the work is working. This is the full mental model now assembled. Value and validation are separate currencies. Validation is fast, addictive, and taxed continuously. Value is slow, quiet, and taxed only when deliberately exposed. The people who understand this don't avoid visibility altogether. They simply stop paying for it by accident. What remains is the practical question of implementation. What does this actually look like, day to day, in a career, in a business, in a life? Not as an abstract principle, but as a set of specific, repeatable choices. That is where the final insight begins. Before moving into application, there's one more layer to the psychology worth understanding, because it explains why even people who fully grasp the exposure tax still sometimes fall back into path A. It's not enough to know the model. You have to understand the specific moments where the pull is strongest, because those are the moments where the model gets abandoned. The pull toward visibility is never stronger than in a moment of uncertainty. When a business is struggling, when a decision feels risky, when the private scoreboard shows something discouraging, the instinct to seek public reassurance spikes sharply. This is precisely backwards from what the model requires. The moments that most need patient, private confirmation are the exact moments people reach hardest for public validation instead, announcing a pivot before it's proven, seeking press during a rough quarter to manufacture the appearance of momentum, going public with a plan specifically because the plan itself doesn't yet feel solid enough to stand on its own. This is worth naming clearly, because it's the trap almost nobody sees coming until they're already in it. Visibility is often sought loudest exactly when the underlying value is weakest, not because people are being dishonest, but because uncertainty creates a hunger for any form of proof, and public reaction is the fastest proof available, even though it has nothing to do with whether the underlying thing is actually working. Contrast this with how the disciplined version of Path B handles the same uncertainty. Doubt gets resolved privately, through more information, more testing, more time, not through an announcement designed to generate reassurance from an audience. This is uncomfortable because it means sitting with unresolved uncertainty for longer, without the temporary relief that public attention provides. But it also means decisions get corrected while they're still cheap to correct, before an audience has been told a story that now has to be defended, regardless of what the facts start to show. A logistics operator once described this exact dynamic. Early in scaling his company, a difficult quarter tempted him to give an interview about exciting growth plans, mostly because he needed to feel like things were under control. He caught himself before doing it, and instead spent that time fixing the actual operational problem quietly. 18 months later, the fix had worked, and there was finally something real worth mentioning, if he'd wanted to. He didn't bother. The business no longer needed anyone to know. This illustrates the final piece of psychology behind the whole pattern. The discipline isn't really about resisting fame. It's about resisting the urge to seek comfort through an audience during exactly the moments comfort feels most necessary, and finding that comfort instead through verified private information, even when that information takes longer to gather and offers no applause when it arrives. This closes the second insight. The pull toward visibility isn't laziness, vanity, or a character flaw. It's an old survival instinct mismatched to a modern environment, amplified by fast validation competing against slow value, and it spikes hardest exactly when uncertainty makes any form of proof feel urgent. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the pull, but it makes the pull recognizable in the moment it appears, which is the only thing that ever allows someone to choose differently. What's left now is translation. Taking this entire model, the exposure tax, the two currencies, the private scoreboard, the discipline of renting visibility instead of living in it, and turning it into something usable. Not a philosophy to admire, but a set of specific shifts anyone can start making immediately, regardless of what they currently do for a living or how visible they currently are. That begins now. Here is the practical shift, stated as simply as possible. Stop asking, how do I get noticed, and start asking, what am I building that doesn't need anyone to notice it in order to work? This single reframe changes almost every decision downstream of it. what to spend time on, what to say yes to, what to walk away from, and what to measure as progress. But like any mental model, it only becomes useful once it's broken into specific, repeatable actions. So here is what applying the invisibility principle actually looks like, across the areas where most people unconsciously pay the exposure tax without realizing it. Start with career. Most people manage their professional reputation the way Path A manages fame, by maximizing how often they're seen, credited, and mentioned. Every project becomes an opportunity for visibility rather than an opportunity to build something the organization actually depends on. The application here is straightforward. Build one thing at work that would be genuinely difficult to replace: a system, a relationship with a key client, a process nobody else fully understands, before worrying about who knows you built it. Indispensability, quietly established, tends to produce recognition eventually anyway. But it produces something more valuable first: security that doesn't depend on anyone's continued attention. Move to money. The exposure tax shows up here as lifestyle visibility, spending patterns designed to signal success rather than build it. The practical shift is to separate what you own from what you display. This doesn't mean living in secrecy or deprivation. It means recognizing that every visible marker of wealth invites a corresponding cost: comparison, solicitation, scrutiny, and pressure to maintain an image, regardless of what's actually happening underneath it. Wealth that grows privately, reinvested rather than displayed, compounds without ever having to defend itself publicly. Now consider relationships, because this is where the principle gets least attention and matters just as much. People often perform closeness for an audience: public displays of loyalty, public credit given to partners and friends, relationships narrated as content instead of simply lived. The private version is quieter and harder to fake, showing up consistently when no one else is watching, keeping commitments that will never be publicly acknowledged, building trust that doesn't require an audience to confirm it's real. This kind of relationship capital compounds the same way financial capital does: slowly, privately, and it tends to be the most durable resource a person has during the moments when public reputation isn't enough to save them. And now the specific mechanism for applying the discipline itself: the strategic use of exposure as a tool rather than a lifestyle. Before stepping into visibility, a public announcement, a media appearance, a moment of being seen, ask one question: what specific transaction is this exposure meant to complete? If there's a clear answer, closing a deal, attracting a specific partner, establishing credibility for one particular purpose, then the exposure is being rented deliberately, and the tax being paid has a clear return attached to it. If there's no clear answer, if the honest reason is closer to "it will feel good to be seen," that's the signal to decline. That feeling is the old instinct described in Insight 2, mistaking an audience's reaction for actual progress. This also reframes how to handle a difficult stretch, a rough quarter, a stalled project, a private doubt. Insight 3's discipline says, resist the urge to seek public reassurance during exactly these moments. Instead, build the habit of a private review, a regular honest look at what's actually true, measured against your own private scoreboard, not against how the situation would look if described to someone else. This is uncomfortable at first, because it removes the temporary relief of an audience's encouragement. But it produces something an audience never can: an accurate read on whether the underlying thing is actually working. None of this requires becoming invisible in some absolute sense. Visibility still has its place: closing deals, building specific relationships, occasionally stepping forward when a moment genuinely calls for it. The shift isn't toward secrecy, it's toward intention. Every appearance becomes a choice made for a reason, rather than a habit maintained out of a need for constant proof. This is what separates the two paths in practice, day to day. One path defaults to being seen and occasionally chooses privacy. The other defaults to privacy and occasionally chooses to be seen. The second path pays the exposure tax rarely, and only when there's something specific to buy with it. There's a specific test worth building into this discipline, because abstract principles are easy to agree with and hard to apply under pressure. Call it the transaction test, before any moment of visibility, a post, an announcement, an interview, a public claim of success. Ask what specific, concrete thing this exposure is meant to purchase, not a feeling, a transaction, a closed deal, a recruited partner, a secured relationship, a credibility requirement that genuinely can't be met privately. If the answer is concrete, proceed. The exposure is a deliberate expense, and deliberate expenses are how the wealthy actually do use visibility. Never as a lifestyle, but as a tool pulled out for a specific job and put away again afterward. If the answer is vague, the honest move is to decline, because vague answers are almost always the old instinct in disguise, a need for reaction dressed up as strategy. This test matters most in the exact moments Insight 2 identified as highest risk: uncertainty, doubt, a discouraging private scoreboard. These are the moments the transaction test gets skipped entirely, because the need for reassurance overrides the discipline to ask the question at all. Building the habit of asking it anyway, especially then, is what separates people who occasionally step into visibility from people who quietly rebuild a dependency on it every time things get hard. There's a second practical tool worth naming here: the private scoreboard itself made concrete. This doesn't need to be complicated. It can be as simple as a monthly number that matters: revenue, savings rate, a specific skill benchmark, a measure of a key relationship's health, reviewed on a private, consistent schedule. The point isn't the specific metric. The point is having something that provides feedback fast enough to satisfy the nervous system's hunger for proof without requiring anyone else to witness it. This is what actually makes the discipline sustainable. Willpower fades. A working feedback loop doesn't. Consider how this plays out over a decade, because that's the real-time horizon this entire model operates on. Someone on path A spends 10 years building a name, recognizable, admired, constantly visible, while the underlying asset base grows slower than it could have, taxed continuously by the costs of maintaining that image. Someone on path B spends the same 10 years mostly unseen, occasionally stepping into visibility for a specific deal or relationship, while the underlying asset base compounds largely undisturbed. At the end of the decade, the first person is known, the second person is secure. Occasionally, later in life, the second person becomes known too, but by then, the fortune was already built, which means the visibility that eventually arrives no longer has anything to tax. There's nothing fragile left for it to threaten. This is the real payoff of the entire model, and it's worth stating plainly. The goal was never to stay hidden forever. Many people who build real wealth this way do eventually become visible, but on their own timeline, after the asset is secure, when visibility can no longer meaningfully damage what's already been built. That's an entirely different position than becoming visible early, before there's anything durable enough to withstand the scrutiny visibility invites. This reframes the entire premise one more time. The invisibility principle was never about hiding. It's about sequencing, building first, in private, where the exposure tax can't reach what hasn't been shown yet, and choosing visibility later, deliberately, once there's something strong enough to survive being seen. Apply this, and the question shifts permanently. Not how do I get noticed faster, but what am I building that will still be standing, undamaged, whenever I eventually decide to let people see it. Bring this all the way down to a single morning, because that's ultimately where any principle either gets used or gets forgotten. Someone starting a business today has two default paths available. The first path says, build in public. Document the journey, share the wins, narrate the struggle, let an audience form around the process before the process has produced anything durable. This feels productive immediately because it generates reaction, and reaction feels like proof. The second path says, build first in private, using a personal scoreboard to track whether the thing is actually working, and treat any public visibility as a deliberate tool used only when a specific transaction requires it. Both paths can succeed, but only one of them builds something that grows stronger the less attention it receives, and weaker the more it gets. That's the distinction worth carrying forward from everything covered here. Not fame versus obscurity, but two entirely different relationships to the same resource. Apply the transaction test daily, not as a rigid rule, but as a pause before any moment of visibility. What is this exposure actually buying? Apply the private scoreboard weekly or monthly. So the nervous system has fast, real feedback that doesn't depend on anyone else noticing. And apply the sequencing principle across years. Build first, where the exposure tax can't reach what hasn't been shown, and let visibility arrive later on your terms, once there's something strong enough to withstand it. This also means recalibrating what impresses you. When a name is everywhere, that's not automatically evidence of value. It might just be evidence of an audience being fed. When something is quiet, unheard of, barely mentioned, that's not automatically evidence of insignificance. It might be evidence of an asset compounding exactly the way it's supposed to, undisturbed by the very attention that would slow it down. None of this requires abandoning ambition, avoiding all recognition, or living without relationships and public moments that matter. It requires knowing, in each specific instance, whether visibility is being rented deliberately for a clear purpose or paid for accidentally out of an old instinct that mistakes being seen for being secure. That instinct isn't a flaw, it's simply outdated, built for small tribes where visibility and survival were the same thing, operating now in a world where visibility and survival have quietly come apart. The people who understand this stop chasing an audience to feel real. They build something real first and let the audience, if it ever arrives, find nothing left to threaten.